Welcome to the deep dive. You're diving into the world of liability insurance.
Ooh, sounds risky.
Well, in a way it is, right? I mean, it's all about protecting yourself
Yeah,
when things go wrong.
absolutely.
And today we're specifically looking at South Carolina.
Oh,
We've got some excerpts from a legal textbook chapter
exciting.
all about liability insurance just in South Carolina.
You know, I gotta say, this stuff is actually pretty fascinating.
It really is.
Like, there's so many cases
Yeah.
and quirks that you just wouldn't expect.
Exactly.
Uh,
So by the end of this,
Yeah.
hopefully you'll know way more than the average driver about what your insurance actually covers.
Yeah, what they're really signing up for.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump right in.
Okay.
So first things first, in South Carolina, having liability insurance on your motor vehicle,
Right.
it's not a suggestion, it's the law.
It's mandatory.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
The law's definition of a motor vehicle, it isn't always what you might think.
Yeah. That's where
Oh, go ahead.
that's where that Motor Vehicle Financial Responsibility Act comes in.
Right?
The MVFRA, it really lays it all out there.
Yeah.
It covers the obvious things,
Right.
your cars, your trucks, trailers. But it also has some stuff you might not expect, like semi-trailers.
Really? So like
Mm-hmm.
those massive 18-wheelers?
Yep, those big guys.
They're under the same rules as my little commuter car.
Under the same umbrella.
Well.
But then there are also some vehicles that you might think need insurance that actually aren't included.
Oh, interesting.
Things like farm tractors, mopeds,
Yeah.
and even, drillers.
Hold on, wool drillers.
Wool drillers, yep.
Why are they exempt?
Well, it's because they're not typically driving around on public roads.
Oh.
You know, that law is really focused on vehicles that are used for highway driving.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
That makes sense.
Public safety and all.
So we know what vehicles need insurance. What about the minimum coverage you're required to have?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in South Carolina, you have to have at least $25,000 for bodily injury to one person,
Wow.
$50,000 total for bodily injury per accident,
Okay.
and then $25,000 for property damage.
That seems kind of low.
Yeah, it is.
I imagine most people
Oh, yeah.
get more coverage than that, right?
They should, absolutely. Because
Yeah.
if you're in a serious accident, those minimums, they're not going to cover much.
Yeah,
You'd be left holding the bag.
you could be personally responsible for a lot.
Hot time.
Okay, good point.
Yeah, so definitely something to think about.
Definitely sticking with my higher coverage.
Good idea.
So we've covered the types of vehicles
Right.
and the minimums,
Mhm.
but how do we know
Yeah.
which specific vehicles are covered under our own policies?
So that's where the idea of a covered auto comes in.
Oh, okay.
And it's not just the car that's listed.
Right.
On your insurance card, it's any vehicle that you have listed in your policy declarations.
Okay.
Plus, typically, new cars,
Yeah.
pickups, vans, trailers that you buy are usually automatically covered as well.
Okay, so that covers the
Yeah.
basics.
The basics.
But I'm guessing it's not always
Well,
that simple.
It gets a little more complicated.
All right,
Well,
so
yeah.
lay it on me. What are we talking about?
All right, so ownership.
Okay.
Now, the law says you only have to have insurance for vehicles that you own.
Right.
But ownership
Yeah.
isn't always so straightforward.
Give me an example.
Okay, so think about buying a car with a loan or leasing a car.
Right.
Legally, you're considered the owner, even if you haven't fully paid for it.
Oh.
So that means you're the one who's responsible for having insurance.
So if I'm making payments
Exactly.
on my leased car,
Mm-hmm.
get into an accident, it's my insurance that's
It is, yeah.
going to have to pay out.
It all comes down to who's financially responsible, really. And there was actually a case, Continental Casualty Co. versus Penn National Insurance Co.,
Okay.
that really highlights this.
Okay.
So this delivery driver, he got into an accident, but his insurance, they tried to deny coverage
Oh, wow.
because they said they didn't own the car.
Well, who did?
It was actually his other employer.
Oh, okay.
But in the end, Pizza Hut
Okay.
was the one that was held responsible for the damages because they were the ones who were ultimately liable for the driver,
Even though they didn't own the car?
even though they didn't own the car he was using.
Wow, that's a good reminder
Yeah.
to really understand what you're signing up for.
Mhm.
What about when you get a new car to replace an old one? Does your coverage automatically switch over?
So most policies have something called a replacement vehicle provision.
Okay.
And this means that your coverage will transfer to your new car.
Right.
If the old one is, like totally out of commission.
Totaled or something.
Yeah, total or just beyond repair.
Okay, it can't be for like a minor issue.
Gotcha. Any interesting cases on this?
Oh, there is one.
Go ahead.
Allstate versus Government Employees Insurance Company.
Okay.
And in this case, this guy's old car was basically unusable.
Okay.
It was up on blocks, tires removed.
Oh, wow.
He bought a second car,
Mm-hmm.
then replaced that with a third car.
Oh, okay.
The court actually decided that both the second and third cars
Wow.
were considered replacements because that first car was clearly done for.
So even a car on blocks.
Even a car on blocks counts as replaced.
And be considered replaced, yeah.
That's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
What about if you get a new car in addition to the ones you already have?
So that's where we get to the newly acquired auto provision.
Okay.
And this usually gives you automatic coverage for a new vehicle
Yeah.
as long as you bought it during your policy period.
Right.
And you tell your insurer within 30 days.
Okay.
But here's the catch. Some policies require you to insure all of your vehicles with the same company
Right.
for that automatic coverage to actually kick in.
So if I have like different cars
Yeah.
insured with different companies, I might not be covered for like a brand new one.
It's possible, yeah. You might think you're good to go.
Yeah.
But if you got your vehicles spread across a few different insurers, you might be in for a surprise.
Oh, wow.
And then some policies even say you have to insure all the vehicles you own, period,
Okay.
for that automatic coverage to work.
That's something I'll be checking
Yeah, definitely worth looking into.
in my own policy.
Mhm.
Okay. So we've covered what kind of vehicles are covered,
All right.
but I know insurance companies,
Yeah.
they love their exclusions.
They do.
What are some situations where our coverage might not apply?
So yeah, there are definitely some things that insurance companies don't want to cover,
Right.
even if you're following the law. So one common exclusion is for non-owned or non-described vehicles.
So if I borrow a friend's car,
Right.
get into an accident,
Mhm.
my insurance won't cover it.
Generally, no. That law really focuses on covering the vehicles that you own,
Yeah.
not just any car that you happen to be driving.
Makes sense. Are there any cases about this?
There's one, Crenshaw versus Preferred Risk Mutual Insurance Company.
Right.
And this involved someone who was considered a statutory insured.
What does that mean?
So that means they were automatically covered under the policy because of a law,
Oh, good.
not because they were specifically named on it.
Okay.
So they're driving a non-owned car,
Right.
got into an accident,
Mhm.
and even though they were technically insured, they weren't covered because they were driving a car that wasn't theirs.
Oh, wow.
And the court really said that the focus is on your own vehicles.
Interesting.
Yes,
Borrowing a car comes with a lot more risk than I realized.
it does. It does.
Other exclusions.
Okay, so another common one
Yeah.
is for automobiles owned by or furnished for the regular use of the insured.
Okay, that one sounds a little complicated.
Yeah, a bit of a mouthful.
What's that all about?
So it's meant to prevent you from basically insuring one car,
Okay.
but regularly driving a bunch of other vehicles
Wait, what?
without paying extra.
So no getting around the system.
Nope, they're on to us.
So if I borrow my neighbor's car every day,
Yeah,
that's not going to fly?
that might raise some eyebrows.
Okay.
So the key is whether it's casual, occasional use or
Right.
regular use.
Right.
And there's a case, South Carolina Farm Bureau Mutual versus Wyndham,
Okay.
where a son borrowed his mom's car sometimes,
Mhm.
and the court had to decide if that was regular use.
And what did they say?
They said it wasn't frequent enough to be considered regular use.
Okay.
So the exclusion didn't apply in that case.
So occasional borrowing is okay.
Yeah, your usual fine.
But if you're treating someone else's car like your own,
Yeah, you're pushing it.
yeah.
Probably going to have some issues.
What about if you let someone else drive your car?
Okay, so that's where we get into the idea of permissive users,
Okay.
which can get a little tricky.
Right.
So the general rule is that anyone driving your car with your permission is covered.
So if I just hand my friend my keys,
Right.
they're good.
That's what we call express permission.
Yep.
But then there's also implied permission,
Oh, interesting.
where your actions kind of suggest consent,
Right.
even if you haven't actually said it out loud.
So if I always let my coworker borrow my car
Uh-huh.
to go to lunch,
Mm-hmm.
and then one day they just take it without asking,
Yeah.
my insurance might still be responsible.
It could be.
Wow.
It really depends on the situation and if their actions seemed reasonable
Okay.
based on your past behavior.
Right.
So there's a case, Rakestraw versus Allstate,
Okay.
and this involved someone borrowing a car to take it home to finish painting it.
Oh, okay.
Sounds innocent enough,
Yeah.
but they weren't supposed to drive it for anything else.
Oh, got it.
So they didn't finish that day, drove the car home,
Right.
and then got into an accident the next day on the way back.
Right.
And the court said that taking the car home was outside the bounds of the implied permission.
Wow. So even if you're trying to be helpful, you really got to set those boundaries when lending out your car. What about if the person I lend my car to lets someone else drive?
That's called a secondary permittee.
Okay.
And that gets even more complicated.
I bet.
So the general rule is that if you forbid your initial borrower from letting anyone else drive, and they do it anyway, your insurance probably won't cover it.
Okay, so if I say, like, you can borrow my car, but only you can drive it.
Right.
And they ignore that I'm off the hook.
That's the idea.
Okay.
But if you give them really general permission, like, go ahead, take my car, no restrictions, then it could be interpreted as implicitly allowing them to let others drive.
Oh, wow.
So even the way you phrase it matters.
Really matters.
And then there's this case.
Maryland Casualty Co. versus State Farm.
Okay.
That adds another wrinkle.
Okay.
So in this case, the policy language about permission, it was actually broader than the law.
Wait, hold on. How can a policy
I know, right?
be broader than the law?
So the policy focused on consenting to use the car.
Great.
Not just operate it.
Okay.
So even if you didn't specifically say they could let others drive, if they had your consent to use the car in general, then your insurance might still have to pay.
Wow. So there's
it gets trickier.
A lot more to think about than just handing over your keys.
It really highlights the importance of not just assuming you understand your policy, but actually reading it carefully.
Well, we've covered the vehicles pretty thoroughly. What about the people?
The people
who are insured under these policies. So who counts as the insured?
Yeah, so it's not...
I'm guessing it's not just...
Not that simple. The person whose name is on it.
Right, it's more than just that one name.
Okay, break it down for me.
Okay, so we've got the named insured, their spouse, if they live in the same house, and then any resident relative.
Resident relative? So like my cousin who's visiting from out of town, they don't count?
Probably not, no. Resident really implies something more permanent than just a temporary visitor. So we're talking about people living together for a significant amount of time.
So like sharing a house.
Exactly, sharing a house.
Okay.
And there's a case, Budden versus Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company, that involved a nephew who lived with his uncle, paid rent, but he was still considered a resident relative.
So even though he was paying rent, he was still considered family.
Exactly, for insurance purposes. So the court basically decided that things like paying rent don't automatically disqualify someone from being a resident.
Oh, that's good to know. So there's some flexibility there.
There is.
But that mostly covers family. What about when you let someone else borrow your car?
Oh, so that's where we get into the concept of permissive users.
Okay.
And
is this where it gets really complicated?
It can, yeah. It's worth diving a little deeper into the nuances of consent and how that affects your coverage.
All right, I'm ready. Lead the way.
Let's do it. All right, so we've talked about who's considered an insured person under your policy.
Right.
But it gets even more interesting when we look at specific exclusions.
Exclusions, all right.
That can limit coverage, even for those insured people.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
So let's start with the employee exclusion.
Employee exclusion, all right.
Basically, this means your insurance might not cover injuries to your employees if they get hurt while they're working for you.
Okay, makes sense, but how does that apply to, like, domestic workers?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Like a nanny, for example.
So domestic workers are usually exempt from this exclusion.
Gotcha.
So, for instance, if your nanny is driving your kids to soccer practice, gets into an accident, they would likely be covered under your policy.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's all about who's working for who. There's a case, State Farm Mutual Automobile Insurance Company versus James, that illustrates this.
All right.
So it involved two coworkers who got into an accident during work, and one of them was driving a borrowed car, and the other was injured. And the insurance company tried to deny coverage using the employee exclusion, even though the car was borrowed.
So even though it wasn't owned by the employer,
it still applied.
They said it was because it happened during work.
Exactly. It was all because it happened in the course of their employment.
So it's not just about who owns the car, but also like the context
exactly.
in which it's being used.
It's all about the context.
Okay, that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Definitely.
What other exclusions?
All right, so another one that's a little more straightforward is the driving under suspension exclusion.
Driving under suspension.
Okay.
I think you could probably guess.
Yeah, if my license is suspended, my insurance company won't cover me.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Okay.
Particularly if your license is suspended for DUI.
Okay.
The insurer can specifically exclude coverage for you in that situation.
Yikes. So, like, if I get a DUI, my license is suspended, my insurance can just drop me.
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh.
But there's an important point here.
Okay.
They can't refuse to cover your family.
Oh, okay, that's good. So at least there's that.
Yeah, your spouse and kids are still protected.
Yeah, even if I make a mistake, at least they're okay.
It's all about protecting those innocent family members.
Yeah, for sure.
Even if the named insured has acted irresponsibly.
All right, what else? Okay, so let's move on to the business use exclusion.
Business use.
Which has been a bit of a legal roller coaster.
So if I, use my personal car to run work errands, am I automatically not covered?
So initially the idea was to prevent businesses from using personal policies for business activity.
Right.
To make sure they had commercial policies.
Gotcha.
That reflected the higher risks. But then a case came along, Pennsylvania National Mutual Casualty Insurance Company versus Parker. That kind of changed things. And the court ruled against completely excluding business use from personal policies.
Interesting. So even if I'm driving for work, I might still be covered under my personal policy.
It's possible, yeah. It depends on the specific language in your policy and how the courts are interpreting it.
Yeah.
So this is definitely an area where it's always best to err on the side of caution.
Right.
Talk to your insurer directly.
Yeah, good advice.
If you're unsure.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these exclusions are about who's driving the car. What about the policyholder themselves?
Oh, so it's like...
Or their family.
Believe it or not.
Have insurance companies ever tried to get out of that?
They have.
Really?
There have been attempts to exclude coverage for resident relatives, spouses.
Wow.
Even the named insured themselves or anyone driving with their permission.
So they're basically saying, we won't cover you.
Yeah.
Even though you're the one paying for this.
Pretty much.
That's crazy.
It's a little illogical.
Yeah.
But luckily there's a case, Jordan versus Aetna Casualty and Surety Company. That put a stop to that. And the court said you can't exclude coverage for injuries to yourself.
Right.
Or members of your household.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah. Otherwise...
What if you back into your own garage door?
Right, exactly. So you can rest assured that you should be covered in those situations.
Okay, all right.
Now, what about intentional acts?
Oh, intentional acts.
Yeah.
Like, can those be excluded?
So it seems logical.
Yeah, like if you deliberately crash your car.
Right.
Your insurance shouldn't have to pay for it.
It does seem that way.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated than that.
Right, I figured.
There's a key case here, South Carolina Farm Bureau Mutual Insurance Company versus Mumford. And the court actually ruled against allowing intentional act exclusions.
Really?
Saying it went against the whole point of mandatory insurance coverage.
So even if, I get road rage and I intentionally hit someone's car.
Yeah.
My insurance might still cover it.
It's possible.
Wow.
So the court emphasized that liability insurance is meant to protect victims.
Right.
So even if you act intentionally, the focus is on making sure that anyone you harm can receive compensation.
Okay. I can see how that makes sense. Yeah.
It's a public policy kind of power.
But doesn't that seem kind of unfair to insurance companies?
Well, it's definitely a point of debate. And a federal court case, Pennsylvania National Mutual Insurance Company versus Dawkins, offers a different view.
Oh, interesting.
They ruled in favor of the insurer, focusing on the idea of freedom of contract.
Freedom of contract.
Yeah.
What does that have to do with insurance?
So the argument is that insurance companies, they should have the right to set their own terms within legal limits.
Right.
And that individuals can choose whether or not to accept those terms.
Okay, so it's a balancing act between
it's a balance.
Protecting victims, even in
cases of intentional harm.
Yeah.
And upholding the rights of insurance companies to kind of set their own terms.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely a gray area.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and it's a debate that courts are still grappling with today.
Okay, so what other exclusions?
Okay, so another exclusion that applies more to businesses is the automobile business exclusion.
Automobile business. So this one's aimed at businesses.
Yeah. Right, not at individuals.
Okay, got it.
So it's designed to make sure that businesses that are involved in selling, repairing, or servicing cars have the right kind of insurance.
So they need a commercial policy.
Yeah, a commercial policy.
Not just a regular.
Exactly. Not trying to rely on a cheaper personal auto policy.
Right.
So, for example, if you're a mechanic and you're test driving a customer's car, your personal insurance probably won't cover you.
Right.
If something happens.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. The idea is to make sure that businesses are appropriately insured.
Right.
For the risks associated with their operations.
But knowing insurance law, I'm guessing there are some. Exceptions or gray areas.
There's always gray areas.
In this, right.
Absolutely. So there's been a number of cases that have challenged the scope of this exclusion. For instance, in American Fire and Casualty Company versus Allstate Insurance Company. A Jeep owner was towing his Jeep behind another vehicle when it was involved in an accident.
So what was the issue?
So the insurer of the Jeep tried to deny coverage. Arguing that the accident didn't result from the use of the Jeep.
What? So they were saying because it wasn't?
Yeah, they were saying towing a vehicle isn't the same as using it.
Oh, wow.
But the court disagreed, saying that even though the Jeep wasn't running, it was still being used in the context of being transported on a public road and was subject to the same risks as any other vehicle.
So that broadens
it kind of stretches
our understanding of what using a car means.
Yeah, it's not so cut and dry.
What about trailers? Are they treated differently?
Trailers are interesting. There's been some back and forth about whether insurance companies can exclude coverage for owned trailers.
Oh, so they were saying they wouldn't cover,
Yeah, basically they were saying they shouldn't have to cover trailers. That are owned by the insured person.
Yeah, interesting.
Their argument was that towing a trailer increases risk. So they should be able to charge extra for it.
Yeah.
But the courts ultimately sided with the insured.
So trailers are usually covered under a standard auto policy.
Generally speaking, yes.
But always double check.
Always double check.
Yeah.
Good advice.
So let's talk about ownership, maintenance, or use.
All right. Ownership, maintenance, or use.
Those are pretty broad terms.
They are.
What do those mean in the context of insurance?
So these are really key to figuring out when liability coverage actually applies. So South Carolina law, it says your policy has to cover damages that arise out of the ownership, maintenance, or use of your vehicle.
So it's not just about driving. It can be any activity.
Yeah, any activity.
Related to the car.
Yeah, related to owning, maintaining, or using your car.
Got it.
Could be covered.
But there have to be some limits, right? It can't be everything.
Of course there are limits. There's a case, Federated Mutual Implement and Hardware Insurance Company versus Gupton. That gives us some clarification on this.
Right, what did they have to say?
So the court in this case, they stressed that ownership, maintenance, or use shouldn't be interpreted too narrowly. They wanted to make sure that people were protected in a range of situations.
So it's not just about
Right, it's not just about the most literal...
Yeah, the most literal
definition of those words. So they acknowledged that there are a lot of different activities that could fall under those categories, and they wanted to make sure that insurance coverage was available.
Right.
In a variety of circumstances. But of course, there are limits. That's where causal connection comes in.
Causal connection,
So to be covered, there has to be a direct link between what you're doing and the accident or injury that occurred. And there's a recent case.
What was a recent case?
Progressive Direct Insurance Company versus Groves. That explores this in detail. So this involved a whole series of events that ended with someone getting shot.
Oh, wow.
And the court had to decide whether the injuries were related to the use of a vehicle.
This is like a whole legal drama?
It is. It's very dramatic. So this case really looked back at a bunch of previous cases to try to trace how South Carolina courts have interpreted this connection.
So it helps us understand
exactly
how the law has developed.
Yeah, how the law has evolved over time.
Awesome.
So one case they considered was Wausau Underwriters Insurance Company versus Hauser, which involved a drive-by shooting.
A drive-by shooting, wow. And so they said that's related to the use of a vehicle.
They did. So they reasoned that the car was an essential part of the assault because it allowed the attacker to pursue the victim and carry out the shooting.
So even though the actual injury was from a gunshot, it was the car that was used to...
Yeah, it was a tool in the crime.
Yeah, okay, interesting.
So it wasn't just about the location, but the way the car was actually used.
Okay, what other cases did they look at?
Okay, so another one was home insurance company versus tow.
Right.
And in this case, someone threw a bottle from a moving car and injured the driver of another car.
Okay, so this time they used the car to...
to launch
the
object.
Okay.
So the court found that the speed of the car made the bottle more dangerous and played a role in how severe the injuries were.
Okay, so even throwing a bottle, if it's from a moving car, it can be...
It can be tied back to the car insurance.
Interesting.
So the Groves case really recognized that these earlier decisions showed how courts were broadening their understanding of use.
Right.
Looking beyond just driving.
It's like they're catching up to how people actually use their cars.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the Groves case also looked at a case that went in the opposite direction.
Oh, interesting.
State Farm Fire and Casualty Company versus Aites.
Okay.
And in this one, the insured person was forced into their own car, driven somewhere else, and then shot while outside the car.
So the car was involved, but...
Yeah, the car was involved, but...
The injury happened outside of it.
The actual injury happened outside the vehicle.
Okay.
And in this case, the court decided that the injuries didn't arise from the use of the vehicle.
Oh, why not?
So they felt that the car wasn't actively involved in the actual shooting.
Got it.
So it broke that connection between the car and the injury.
Okay, so even though the car played a part, they said it wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough, yeah. Okay. So the Groves case really shows that there's still debate in South Carolina law about just how broad ownership, maintenance, or use really is.
Okay.
So it's a reminder that each case has its own unique circumstances.
It's very fact-specific.
Very fact-specific.
What other areas of this do we need to cover?
Okay, so one that often comes up is loading and unloading a vehicle.
Loading and unloading. Okay.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought of that as,
right.
particularly dangerous.
But, if you think about it, all the lifting potential for dropped objects, even just opening and closing doors.
Right,
Accidents can happen.
For sure. So is loading and unloading covered under your auto policy?
It can be, but it's a common source of confusion and legal battles.
Of course it is.
So
that's the general rule.
Okay. So many policies include loading and unloading in their definition of use.
Okay.
But even if it's not specifically stated, courts might still interpret it that way.
So hypothetically, if I'm helping a friend move and I drop a dresser on their foot while unloading a truck, their auto insurance might cover it.
It's possible, yeah.
Wow.
So there are different legal theories about how loading and unloading coverage works. So some policies are very strict.
Right.
Others are a little more lenient.
Right. Are there any cases that we can look at to kind of see how these play out?
Absolutely.
Right.
There's one called Wren and Outlaw, Inc. versus Employers Liability Assurance Corporation.
Okay.
And in this case, a bag boy at a grocery store closed a customer's car door on her hand.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
were they trying to decide?
Yeah, the question
is that was covered under loading and unloading.
Was this loading and unloading or not?
Yeah.
And the court said it was.
Oh, wow.
So the grocery store's insurance had to pay.
The customer's injury.
For the customer's injury.
Oh, wow. So even something... It was all because, the court reasoned, helping customers load their groceries was part of the store's business and therefore connected to the use of the customer's car.
Oh, wow. So even something as routine as packing groceries.
It can be.
Can become a liability issue.
Exactly. It's all about the bigger picture, not just that one action. What other cases?
Okay, so another one that's interesting is Home Indemnity Company versus Harleysville Mutual Insurance Company.
Okay.
And this involved a lumber delivery.
A lumber delivery, all right.
So the delivery driver, he unloaded a stack of lumber.
Okay.
But didn't secure it properly.
Oh, no.
left it leaning up against a wall.
Okay.
And later a customer bumped into it, causing it to fall
okay.
and injure them.
So they were trying to decide if this happened during unloading, even though the driver was already gone?
Yeah. Was it still part of the unloading process?
Okay.
And the court said yes.
They said yes. So even though he had physically unloaded the lumber,
right.
the fact that he didn't secure it meant that it was still part of the process.
Wow. So it's not just about moving things, but also making sure that they're
it's about safety.
Left in a safe way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a responsibility that comes with loading and unloading.
Okay. Interesting.
And then there's another aspect of this.
Okay.
It can actually extend beyond the people doing the loading and unloading.
So like bystanders?
Yeah, bystanders, people who aren't even touching the cargo.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a case, Federated Mutual Implement and Hardware Insurance Company versus Gupton, that illustrates this perfectly.
Okay.
So a store employee was helping a customer load fertilizer into their car, and the employee messed up, pushed the fertilizer bag.
Oh, no.
Causing it to fall on the customer's foot. Okay. So even though the employee wasn't carrying the bag, their actions were still considered part of the loading process.
Right.
And because of that, the store's liability insurance covered the customer's injuries.
So loading and unloading
it's tricky.
Way more complicated than it sounds.
It's a lot more than just putting things in and out of a vehicle.
Okay.
It's all about those actions leading up to it.
Okay.
And ensuring things are done safely.
And it really shows how important it is to be aware of the potential risks involved in anything you do with your car.
Absolutely.
Even things that seem pretty mundane.
Mm-hmm.
This is so insightful.
It's fascinating stuff.
Really?
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground.
We have.
I'm ready to wrap this up.
Yeah.
And hear the final takeaways of what our listeners should really remember.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've really gone from the very basics of, what is a motor vehicle to some pretty complex legal theories about, loading and unloading and the scope of ownership, maintenance, or use.
Right. It's a lot. And I feel like hopefully we've given our listener a lot more insight into the ins and outs of their own policies.
I hope so. The more you understand, the better you can protect yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's all about being an informed consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So to wrap things up, what would you say are the most important things for our listener to remember as they kind of go about their daily lives, driving, lending out their cars, maybe helping friends move?
Oh, well, first and foremost, don't just assume you understand your policy,
Yeah.
Actually take the time to read it.
Yeah.
Even that fine print, and if anything is unclear, don't hesitate to reach out to your insurer or a legal professional for clarification.
Yeah, it's so easy to just file those documents away and never look at them again.
Yeah. Out of sight, out of mind. But knowledge is power in this case.
For sure, yeah. So knowledge is power, and in this case, could save you a lot of headache.
And money.
Potentially a lot of money.
Big time.
What else? What else should they be thinking about?
Well, communication is key.
Okay.
If you're letting someone else drive your car, be very clear about what you're allowing them to do.
Right.
Who else can drive, and really what those boundaries are.
Right.
Setting those expectations up front can really help avoid those misunderstandings and potential liability issues down the road.
It seems like the specific words you use really matter.
Absolutely.
When it comes to insurance.
The devil's in the details.
Yeah, for sure.
And lastly, I'd say be mindful of the risks involved in any activity related to your vehicle.
Okay.
Even those that might seem mundane.
Right.
So whether you're loading groceries, helping a friend move furniture, or even just closing a car door, an accident can happen in a split second.
Yeah, for sure.
So always prioritize safety. Take the necessary precautions to prevent those unfortunate incidents.
Yeah, that's a great reminder that being aware and taking responsibility for our actions can really help us avoid problems, protect ourselves and others.
Being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. Okay, I have one final question for you before we wrap up completely.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about South Carolina specifically.
Right.
But is there a broader message here that you think applies to anyone, no matter where they live?
I think there is. What we've seen in these South Carolina cases, it reflects a trend that we're seeing across the country.
Okay.
This growing awareness of just how complex insurance law really is.
Right.
And a push to interpret these laws in a way that's fair, protecting both individuals and insurers, but also keeping that overall goal of public safety in mind.
So even if you're not in South Carolina, it's still worth paying attention to these cases.
Absolutely.
And how they might be shaping insurance law elsewhere.
Absolutely. What happens in one state can often influence legal decisions, policy changes in other states. It's all connected.
So it's all part of being an informed citizen.
An informed and proactive citizen.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It's been a journey.
Into the fascinating world.
It has.
Of liability insurance in South Carolina.
It's been a pleasure unpacking these legal complexities with you, listener.
And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring, asking questions, and staying informed.
Absolutely.
Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and drive carefully.
Drive safe.